My grandmother left my sister $1 million after I spent 5 years caring for her. My name is Savannah Blake. I'm 31 years old, and I spent 5 years taking care of my grandmother while my sister built a completely different life 3 states away. I changed bandages. I organized medications. I slept beside hospice beds. I canceled vacations. I emptied my savings account paying for things insurance refused to cover. And when my grandmother died, my sister inherited everything. The house. The investment accounts. The jewelry my grandmother had promised me since I was 12. Almost $1 million. I received a handwritten letter. In it, my grandmother called me the strong one. She said I had my career, my savings, my independence. She said my sister needed help more than I did. That was her explanation. That was the reason. 3 months later, my sister called me in the middle of the night because most of the money was already gone. She begged me to save her. I said no. Half my family still refuses to speak to me because of what happened next. But none of them know about the final letter. The one my grandmother left behind. The one I didn't find until months after the funeral. And what she wrote inside changed the way I understand everything that happened. Stay with me. Because the last thing my grandmother gave me wasn't money. And it may have been the only thing she ever intended only for me. Welcome back to Stories of Unbroken, where the people who spent years carrying everyone else finally get to tell what happened when they stopped. If you've ever been called the strong one in your family, the responsible one, the person nobody worried about because you always seemed fine, this story may feel painfully familiar. Tell me where you're listening from. And if stories like this speak to you, subscribe before we begin. Because this story ends somewhere I never expected. To understand what happened in that lawyer's office, you have to understand the family I grew up in. My grandmother, Eleanor, raised my sister Brielle and me after our parents divorced and eventually disappeared into separate lives that had very little room left for either of us. Eleanor wasn't particularly affectionate. She wasn't the kind of grandmother who baked cookies every weekend or told us we could do anything we wanted. She believed in responsibility. She taught us how to balance a checkbook. She taught us to save money. She taught us to finish what we started. And despite everything that happened later, I never doubted that she loved us. She simply had her own language for showing it. Brielle and I were very different children. Brielle was beautiful. Charming. Funny. People wanted to help her. Teachers excused her mistakes. Friends covered for her. Boyfriends rescued her. Even when she failed, someone always appeared to catch her. I was different. I earned good grades because nobody reminded me to study. I worked part-time through college. I paid my own bills. I built my savings account one careful deposit at a time. When something went wrong, I figured it out. People often praised me for being independent. What I didn't understand at the time was that independence can slowly become invisibility. The person who never asks for help eventually becomes the person nobody thinks needs it. By my late 20s, I had a stable job as a claims coordinator. I rented a small apartment. I had modest savings. My life wasn't exciting, but it was steady. Brielle had changed jobs several times. She had been evicted twice. Relationships came and went. Every few months there seemed to be another crisis. Another boyfriend. Another emergency. Another reason somebody needed to rescue her. And somehow, everyone still worried about Brielle. Nobody worried about me. At the time, I thought that meant I was doing something right. Years later, I would realize it was quietly becoming my role in the family. Brielle needed saving. I needed nothing. At least that was what everyone believed. When Eleanor's health began to decline, there was never a family discussion about who would help. There was simply a phone call from her doctor. And then there was me. At first, I rearranged my work schedule. I drove 40 minutes after work several times a week. I helped organize medications. I attended appointments. I bought groceries. But illnesses do not stay small. Neither do responsibilities. Months became years. The visits became daily. The daily visits became entire weekends. Eventually hospice entered the picture. And my entire life slowly rearranged itself around my grandmother's needs. I learned every medication schedule. Every symptom. Every warning sign. I knew which silences meant she was tired. Which ones meant she was afraid. Which ones meant pain. I spent money from my own savings account on medical supplies insurance refused to cover. A better wheelchair cushion. A special mattress. Small things that made difficult days easier. I canceled a vacation I had spent 2 years saving for because Eleanor had a particularly difficult week. And I couldn't bring myself to leave. Some nights I slept in a chair beside her bed. Some mornings I drove directly from her house to work after only a few hours of sleep. I don't tell you these things because I expected payment. I didn't. I loved my grandmother. Someone needed to help. And I have never been the kind of person who can watch someone suffer and simply walk away. That part of me is real. Nothing that happened afterward changes that. But I would be lying if I said a small part of me didn't believe that eventually someone would notice. That 5 years of showing up would matter. That love and effort would count for something. Meanwhile, Brielle sent text messages. She sent one on Mother's Day. Another on Eleanor's birthday. Sometimes she called. Very rarely. But in 5 years, she visited only a handful of times. There was always a reason. Work. Money. Stress. Relationships. Distance. And every time, someone excused her. Usually Eleanor herself. Your sister has a hard life. Your sister struggles. Your sister needs understanding. I never argued. Because by then, being understanding had become my job. What I didn't know was that my grandmother had already started making a decision. A decision that would eventually change all of our lives. And the first time she tried to explain it to me, I didn't understand what she was really saying. The last few weeks of Eleanor's life were strangely peaceful. Hospice nurses often talk about something they call the rally. A sudden burst of energy. A brief return of clarity. A candle burning brighter before it finally goes out. 3 days before she died, Eleanor had one of those afternoons. She asked me to open the curtains. She asked for tea. She even asked me to sit beside her bed and talk for a while. For the first time in weeks, she looked like my grandmother again. Not a patient. Not someone dying. Just Eleanor. We talked about ordinary things. The weather. My job. The flowers outside her bedroom window. And then she reached for my hand. Her fingers felt cold. Much lighter than I remembered. She looked directly at me and said something that, at the time, sounded like comfort. You've always been the strong one. I smiled. Because people had said that to me my entire life. Teachers. Friends. Coworkers. Family. I thought she meant it as a compliment. She squeezed my hand. You've always known how to take care of yourself. I nodded. You have your career. You have your savings. You've built your own life. She paused for a moment. Brielle struggles. She always has. I know you'll understand. At the time, I thought she was worried about my sister. I thought she was asking me to continue being patient with her after she was gone. I had no idea she was quietly explaining a decision she had already made. She died 11 days later. I was holding her hand. The hospice nurse sat quietly in the corner. The room was dark except for a small lamp near the bed. The breathing had become slower throughout the evening. Long pauses. Then another breath. Then another. And eventually there wasn't one. I remember looking at the clock. I remember the nurse touching my shoulder. I remember realizing that the woman who had raised me was gone. Brielle wasn't there. I honestly don't know where she was. I never asked. At the time, grief felt much larger than anger. The funeral passed in a blur. People brought casseroles. Flowers arrived. Relatives appeared who hadn't visited in years. Everyone talked about how strong I had been. Everyone thanked me for taking care of Eleanor. Everyone told me she had been lucky to have me. And I believed those words. Because I thought they meant something. 9 days after the funeral, Brielle and I met at the attorney's office. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't thinking about money. I honestly expected the meeting to be little more than paperwork. Because in my mind, the important things had already been decided. 5 years of showing up. 5 years of caregiving. 5 years of sacrifice. Surely those things mattered. The attorney placed 2 folders on the table. One in front of Brielle. One in front of me. I noticed immediately that mine was much thinner. At first, I thought it contained documents that would need signatures later. The attorney opened Brielle's folder first. The Portland house. Approximately $600,000. Investment accounts. Almost $400,000. My grandmother's jewelry collection. The same collection she had shown me since childhood. The same pieces she once told me would be mine. Every single asset. Every account. Every possession. Everything. All of it went to Brielle. For several seconds, I honestly believed there had been some kind of mistake. I looked at the attorney. He looked back at me calmly. I asked if another page was missing. He said no. I asked if the documents had been switched. He said no. He explained that Eleanor had revised the will 4 months before her death. She had been evaluated. She had been fully competent. There had been witnesses. There had been notarization. There was absolutely no legal question. She had made the decision herself. And somehow that hurt even more. Because illness couldn't be blamed. Confusion couldn't be blamed. Memory loss couldn't be blamed. She knew exactly what she was doing. The attorney then handed me my folder. Inside was a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front. I opened it. The letter was short. Only 2 paragraphs. She called me her strong one. She said I had my career. My savings. My independence. She said Brielle needed more help than I did. She said she knew I would understand. She said she loved us equally. Equally. I still remember staring at that word. 5 years of medications. 5 years of appointments. 5 years of cancelled plans. 5 years beside a hospice bed. And 1 Mother's Day text message. Equal. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't ask another question. I simply stood up. I thanked the attorney. And I walked outside. I sat in my car for almost an hour. And the strangest part is that I didn't cry. People imagine grief as tears. But what I felt wasn't grief. It was colder than that. It was the realization that the thing I believed my entire life had just collapsed. I believed effort mattered. I believed loyalty mattered. I believed love eventually became visible. Instead, I had been handed a compliment. Being called strong wasn't a reward. It was the reason I had been overlooked. What I didn't know at the time was that this wasn't the only letter my grandmother had written. And months later, another envelope would change everything I thought I understood. But first, my sister called. For almost 3 months, I convinced myself I was finished thinking about the inheritance. I went back to work. I went back to my apartment. I returned to the quiet life I had spent years building, one careful decision at a time. I stopped answering unknown numbers. I blocked Brielle. I told myself that whatever my grandmother had decided, I couldn't change it. And slowly, life began settling again. Then, on a Tuesday night at 11 o'clock, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Something told me to answer. At first, I could barely understand the voice. Someone was crying. Almost hyperventilating. Eventually, I realized it was Brielle. She was sobbing so hard she couldn't finish sentences. At first, I honestly thought someone had died. But nobody had died. At least not physically. Over the next 15 minutes, she explained what the previous 3 months had looked like. A new luxury SUV. Designer clothes. Furniture. A 2-week trip to Bali. Expensive restaurants. Weekend trips. And then she mentioned the boyfriend. The same boyfriend who had been unemployed for most of the previous year. Apparently, he had convinced her to invest $80,000 into his cryptocurrency startup. The startup didn't exist. The money was gone. By the time she finished talking, nearly $300,000 had disappeared. 3 months. $300,000. I sat in silence. Part of me couldn't even understand how someone spends that much money that quickly. Another part of me understood perfectly. Because people who spend their lives being rescued often assume there will always be another rescue waiting. Then she finally said why she had called. She needed $4,000. Her rent was due. She couldn't make the payment. She said she was scared. She said she didn't know what to do. And for the first time in my entire life, my younger sister was asking me to save her. Again. I asked one question. Where is the inheritance? She started crying harder. She said she had made mistakes. She said she had trusted the wrong people. She said she was grieving. She said she wasn't thinking clearly. Maybe all of that was true. But I kept thinking about the hospice room. The medications. The appointments. The years. I kept thinking about the letter. You've always been the strong one. And suddenly I realized something. My grandmother had left my sister the money because she believed Brielle needed help. Now Brielle wanted me to help her spend it. I took a deep breath. And I said no. There was silence. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then something changed. The crying stopped. Completely. And the screaming started. She called me selfish. She called me jealous. She said I was bitter. Cruel. Heartless. She told me our grandmother would be ashamed of me. She said if I truly loved Eleanor, I would honor her wishes. I asked her what she meant. She said our grandmother had chosen her for a reason. That Eleanor wanted her taken care of. That helping her was what my grandmother would have wanted. I remember sitting there holding my phone and thinking how unbelievable the situation had become. The inheritance that excluded me was now being used to guilt me into replacing it. The same decision that had erased 5 years of caregiving was somehow becoming my responsibility. I told her something I had never said out loud before. Grandma believed you needed help more than I did. If she was right, then you'll figure it out. And if she was wrong, then maybe she should have trusted me instead. She started screaming again. I hung up. And I blocked the number. For 4 days, everything was quiet. Then, at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, somebody began pounding on my apartment door. Not knocking. Pounding. The kind of pounding that immediately makes your heart race. I looked through the peephole. It was Brielle. She looked exhausted. Her hair was unwashed. She was crying. And before I even opened the door completely, she pushed her way into the hallway. She had an eviction notice. The car payment had been missed. The boyfriend had disappeared. Credit cards were maxed out. She kept talking so quickly that I could barely understand her. Then she grabbed my arms. She begged me to take out a loan. Not lend her money. Take out a loan in my own name. She promised she would pay me back. She promised she would fix everything. She promised this was temporary. And suddenly I realized something that frightened me. She genuinely believed I would do it. Because I always had. Not with money. But with responsibility. With understanding. With forgiveness. She believed that if she cried hard enough, eventually I would save her. The same way everyone always had. And for the first time in my life, I didn't. I asked her to leave. She refused. I asked again. She started screaming. Neighbors opened their doors. Someone stepped into the hallway. And standing there in my pajamas at 7 in the morning, I made a decision I never imagined making. I called the police. The officers arrived 15 minutes later. They spoke to her calmly. More calmly than I probably could have. She cried. She shouted. She told them I was abandoning her. She told them I was her only family. She told them I was ruining her life. Eventually, they escorted her outside. As she walked away, she turned around and screamed something I'll never forget. "You're killing me." And then? "Everyone is going to know who you really are." The police cars left. The neighbors returned to their apartments. And I stood alone in my doorway wearing socks and an old t-shirt. I expected guilt. I expected shame. Instead, I felt something else. Relief. The kind of relief that comes when a fever finally breaks. Because for the first time in my life, I had stopped rescuing someone. And I didn't yet realize that my grandmother had predicted this moment long before it happened. Because there was still one letter I hadn't read. And one sentence that would eventually change everything. After the police came, I changed my locks. I blocked every number Brielle used. I went back to work. I tried to return to normal life. But normal felt different now. Word spread through the family quickly. Apparently, Brielle had her own version of events. According to her, I had abandoned her. I had refused to help. I had called the police on my own sister. My aunt called me cruel. A cousin told me family should always come first. Even one of my coworkers said maybe I should have helped her just once. Just enough to get back on her feet. I listened. I nodded. And every single time, I thought about the hospice room. I thought about the medication schedules. The doctor appointments. The sleepless nights. The vacations I never took. The money I spent. The years. And I thought about the letter. "You've always been the strong one." People kept telling me family helps family. But where had that family been for 5 years? Where had all these opinions been when someone needed to sit beside a hospital bed? Where had all these people been when Eleanor couldn't breathe? Through a cousin, I eventually learned what happened to Brielle. The boyfriend disappeared. The luxury car was repossessed. She moved in with our aunt. The Portland house was falling behind on property taxes. And the jewelry. The jewelry my grandmother had promised me since I was 12 years old. The pieces I used to try on in front of her bedroom mirror. Those pieces were being sold. One by one. To pay credit card debt. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I needed the money. I had my job. My apartment. My savings. The same savings account my grandmother used as evidence that I didn't need help. No. No. What hurt was watching promises disappear. Watching memories become receipts. Watching 5 years of devotion reduced to a sentence. "You're strong." And I honestly believed that was where the story ended. Until my phone rang. It was the attorney. The same attorney who had handled my grandmother's estate. He sounded hesitant. He explained that while reviewing Eleanor's safety deposit box records, they had found something. A small envelope. Apparently, it had been tucked inside an old document folder. It had only one name written on it. Mine. Not mine and Brielle's. Just mine. For several moments, I couldn't speak. He asked if I wanted to pick it up. I said yes. The envelope felt strangely light. The handwriting was different from the first letter. More shaky. More fragile. I sat in my car outside the attorney's office for almost 20 minutes before opening it. Because honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear from my grandmother again. The first sentence stopped me completely. If you're reading this, I was too afraid to say these things while I was alive. I read it twice. Then a third time. The letter was longer than the first one. And very different. She wrote that she knew. She knew who sat beside her bed. She knew who organized her medications. She knew who spent money they couldn't afford. She knew who canceled vacations. She knew who stayed during the nights she was afraid. She knew who held her hand when she died. And then she wrote something that I still struggle to forgive. I spent my entire life trying to save Brielle. I left her the money because I was afraid of what would happen if nobody did. Then she wrote, I left nothing to you because I believed you would survive me. I remember staring at those words. Not because they made me feel better. In some ways, they made me feel worse. Because she knew. She had always known. She knew exactly who had sacrificed. She knew exactly who had stayed. She knew exactly what it had cost me. And she still made her decision. But then she wrote something else. It wasn't fair. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't because you deserved less. I simply believed you were strong enough to survive disappointment. I sat in that car for a very long time. And then I reached the last paragraph. The final lines. The words nobody else in my family has ever read. Please don't spend the rest of your life rescuing people simply because you can. I read that sentence over and over. Because for the first time in my entire life, my grandmother wasn't asking me to be the strong one. She wasn't asking me to understand. She wasn't asking me to sacrifice. She wasn't asking me to save anyone. She was giving me permission to stop. That letter didn't change the will. It didn't return the jewelry. It didn't erase 5 years. It didn't make the decision fair. But it changed something inside me. For most of my life, I believed strength meant carrying everyone. I believed love meant sacrifice. I believed responsibility meant endless availability. I believed being dependable meant never saying no. My grandmother's final gift wasn't money. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the investments. It wasn't the jewelry. It was permission. Permission to stop rescuing people who refuse to rescue themselves. Permission to stop confusing love with sacrifice. Permission to choose myself. Today, I still live in the same apartment. I still work the same job. I started therapy. I changed my locks. I travel now. I take vacations. I say no. And perhaps for the first time in my life, I no longer believe that being strong means being available to everyone. Maybe the real inheritance wasn't money. Maybe it wasn't property. Maybe the only thing my grandmother ever intended to leave me was the understanding that strength is not a debt. If you've ever been called the strong one in your family, the responsible one, the one who always understands, I want you to hear this. Being capable is not a debt you owe other people. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to need help. And you are allowed to stop rescuing people simply because you can. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is finally choose yourself. And maybe that was the lesson my grandmother wanted me to learn all along. If this story reached something real in you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever been called strong when what people really meant was convenient? And if you'd like to hear more stories from people who spent years carrying everyone else, subscribe to Stories of Unbroken. Because there are many people who stayed silent for years. And they are finally ready to tell what happened when they stopped.